Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So I see that people are still logging on. Let's just give it a couple more minutes before we start. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Hi again, everybody. Thanks for waiting. Let's just give it one more minute before we start. Just a reminder to all panelists and attendees that I'm recording this session. Also, it's both UNDP internal and also external audiences on the line. So just in case that affects your presentation at all. Thank you. Hi again, everyone. Thanks so much for bearing with us. Thanks for waiting. So my name is Filza, and I'm from the UNDP Global Center in Singapore. And I lead the communications and engagement efforts for our center. Thanks once again for joining us for the Smart City training series. This is a series of webinars that we have been holding around various smart city topics. Previously, we've done webinars around urban mobility, big data, and the circular economy. Today, we're going to be talking about lean data. What is that, right? It's basically a very practical measurement approach to help you drive meaningful change in government products and services. Well, that's the spiel anyway. And today we're going to have a couple of really great speakers who are going to be bringing us a bit deeper into this topic. So on the line right now, we've got Katie Mountain. She's a business development manager at this social impact measurement company called 60 Decibels. They've got really interesting stuff that they're doing right now. One of the big projects that they're working on is obviously around COVID-19 and its impact on communities all over the world. She's going to be bringing us through that a bit later. And then we've got our very own Callum Hanforth as well. So he's our Smart Cities and Digitalization Advisor here at the Global Center. And he does lots of really great training series webinars as well. Today, he'll be sharing an external project actually. It's going to be around Facebook Messenger and chatbot deployment. So I will hand over to him really quickly right now, and then we will hand over to Katie to take it away. So Callum, would you like to start?
Perfect. Thank you, Phil, and welcome to everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're joining us from. Dipakshi, can we move to the next slide? Perfect. So, excellent. There we go. So, just as Phil just mentioned, I'll give a quick introduction, hand over to Katie, and then come back to a quick case study as well before we open up to questions. And I think Phil's made a note in the chat box there. Please feel free to add your questions as the presentation goes on. We should speak for about 35 minutes and then leave enough time for questions at the end. So Dipakshi, just the next slide. And one more. Perfect. So the Global Center, UNDP Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development has a particular focus on smart cities and digitalization. A lot of this work is about supporting our country offices and their government partners with implementing smart city projects, initiatives, or other collaborations. But we're also doing a lot of work around sharing knowledge and building expertise, including through things like this smart city training series, as Phil mentioned in the introduction. Just on the next slide. So our smart cities approach is split into three main areas. The first one is what we call thematic areas, and these tend to be areas of prioritization for cities, so particular projects, which might be things like mobility, resilience, or other initiatives. But these are underpinned and driven by what we call smart city drivers. So these are the kind of foundational infrastructural elements that are needed to make a smart city happen. And when we talk about a smart city, we're very keen to stress, sorry, patches, perfect. When we talk about a smart city, we are very keen to stress that it's about technology and innovation. So that innovation includes things like behavior change, nature-based solutions, and indigenous knowledge. So we don't just want to focus just on the technology, because a lot of the time everything else is just as, or sometimes even more important. And then we're also informed by what we call our guiding principles. And that's very much that systems approach, being practical and outcomes focused, and inclusivity and sustainability in everything that we do. So just moving to the next slide. Perfect. Before I hand over to Katie, just to flag that this is, as Phil mentioned, an ongoing series of training, and we've run a number of sessions so far on big data, on mobility, and others as well. And we've got a few more coming up before we take a little bit of a break for summer. After this session, we'll share an email with you all with links to those as well, and very keen to see you in future sessions. I think when you signed up for this session, you did suggest topics. That's been really important for us, and we're going through the list of topics suggested in previous webinars, so we can then build a really exciting curriculum into autumn and into next year. So with no further delay, I'll hand over to Katie.
Thank you very much, Callum and Phil. Thank you. And again, yes, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever everybody is. I'm here in London this morning. So my name is Katie Mountain. I work for 60 Decibels, which is the organisation behind the lean data approach to impact measurement. And I'm going to spend the next 15-20 minutes sharing a bit about the lean data approach, how it works, and really sharing some top tips that we've learned over the last 5 years in developing this lean data impact measurement approach, in the hope that some of this might be useful to you and your work to take forward to help you to measure and understand your impact performance. And a bit of context before I delve into the approach. This approach, lean data, started within Acumen, the Global Impact Investment Fund, Acumen. And it was a way in which they wanted to understand and measure the impact performance of their portfolio. As many funds and programs, and some of you may have experienced this, we struggle to get high quality and useful impact data about the social impact of our portfolios. We identified a number of different metrics. We asked our portfolio to report on it. And actually what happened was, it was difficult for those companies to submit the data. What we were getting through was a little bit patchy. varying in quality, and actually we were really thinking that it was only really scratching the surface of what we wanted to understand, which really was what change is happening on the ground through the programs and companies that we're investing in. So if we can go on to the first slide. The concept of lean data started with our desire to create a simple way to measure our impact, and one that shifted impact measurement from this top-down compliance into something that creates real value for investors and enterprises alike. We wanted to make sure that we put the beneficiary at the heart of impact measurement and made this really grassroots about what them and what they needed, rather than our own assumptions. And we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just about proving our impact to ourselves and the world, but would really help us generate data that could be used to make ongoing decisions around how we can improve and maximize our performance going forward. And so these were some of the core principles behind how this approach was developed. So if we go to the next slide, simply at its core, it's about listening to the people that matter the most. Most of what we call social impact comes down to people's lived experiences. So we wanted to speak to them to understand, to the people that we are there to serve, what is their experience of the programs, the products, the services that we're working with. And our aim through this approach is to understand their lived experience. We also want to empower them and have them and their voices be a key part of our decision making around how we're designing products and services, taking investment decisions, making strategies, etc. I think, as we mentioned, as I mentioned up front, I think a lot of the time people start with the what when it comes to impact measurement. What do I want to measure? One of the key things up front really to think about is the how. How are you going to generate this data? And really upfront finding an effective and repeatable way to collect impact data, and ideally one that is done without burdening companies and beneficiaries. And really, we knew that to make listening to beneficiaries a normal part of operations and decision making for these businesses and for us as a fund and programs, it needed to be simple, cost effective, efficient, and repeatable. So I'm going to go through this approach, like I say, and talk through what's being developed, what's needed in order for us to deliver it, what are the different stages, and some kind of top tips we've learned from doing this ourselves. So if we go on to the next slide, there are some core capabilities that were needed in order to deliver this kind of impact measurement approach. And first and foremost, the first was around developing a set of repeatable survey modules that can generate the kind of data that is useful to your programs and funds and organizations. How we've done that, we've structured it with one core survey module, so pulling out the questions that are used in every single study, no matter what sector, size, or organization. Really, we have a list of these 7 metrics that matter, so that are relevant to all organizations. And what's important there is that because we're asking the same questions in lots of organizations over time, that really allows us to be able to compare performance over time and between organizations. So obviously done in such a way that it becomes relevant to all organizations regardless of sector. And I'll go through some examples of what they have been for us. And as well as the core survey modules, we have developed a set of sector-specific and thematic modules, which for us have been around agriculture, off-grid energy, gender, job quality, financial inclusion, really based on demand. But what that allows us to do is put together a full survey for an individual study that uses standardized survey modules both across all and depending on what sector and impact focus. We've, in order to deliver the data collection, how we have built up our capability is we've trained local researchers in the countries that we do data collection. So to date, we have 330 trained researchers globally in different countries, and training them according to our own curriculum, which is also open source. If you would like to learn a little bit more about how we're training our researchers. But importantly, we always use local people doing data collection in local language, and the majority of the data collection is done over the telephone. So that enables us to do this quite fast in a way that is remote, which makes it very COVID friendly. and at a relatively low cost. And I'll go into this a bit more and share a bit about how we're doing that data collection and some of our tips to do remote data collection on telephone if it's something that you're thinking of doing. It's also importantly have found ways to ensure that we're making this data useful and actionable, making sure that we're collecting data that allows programs, companies, funds to take decisions. And thanks to the high volume of projects we've completed across multiple sectors, we've been able to build up a database of impact benchmarks. And again, we'll go into why that's important, something that we'd encourage all organisations to try and do, because it really helps you to be able to improve and understand impact performance by giving you a comparator around what good performance look like, what best in class looks like, to be able to really kind of contextualize the impact data that you get back. And we've done this now for over 300 organisations globally. And really the one thing I'll say in this approach is that repeatability is key. We found delivering one-off impact studies for organisations will give interesting case studies and interesting stats. But in order to understand if we're doing well in our performance or if we're doing worse in some elements, we really need to take that performance mindset and be doing repeatable data collection to understand, like I say, kind of comparable metrics over time. That really is, repeatability has been key to the success of some of these studies being used and taken up by organisations that allow performance improvement to happen over time. So if we go to the next slide, this gives an overview of the lean data process that we go through with individual organisations. So this is how we would set it up. This is what's worked well for us as an organisation. And I'll share some top tips from some of these stages from our studies over the next 10 minutes or so. So we start always understanding the organisation's goals and then translating this into a well-designed survey to capture the data and insights that are useful for that organisation. So we ask organisations and programmes questions like, what do you need to know to understand if your plan or strategy has been effective? What forward-looking plans and decisions are you making that would be useful to generate insights from your beneficiaries to feed into? And we'll develop indicators and question sets around that, but also ensuring that we have sufficiently open questions to capture any insights that we didn't think to ask, which is also quite important, to have that element of flexibility to get your beneficiaries to tell you something that you might not have seen or designed yourself. Then there's the data collection period, where our researchers carry out hundreds of telephone interviews with beneficiaries. And then that data is analysed by aggregating results, looking at trends and comparisons in the data, doing segmentation analysis and benchmarking the data to make it as helpful, useful and actionable as possible. We have a process of coding the qualitative insights we get back, which means that when we ask people open-ended qualitative feedback questions, we code them according to certain categories. That means that we can still aggregate results, which is incredibly helpful when it comes to working with lists of hundreds and hundreds of open-ended feedback from beneficiaries. So it's a very, very good method I'd encourage people to look at to be able to turn those into top comparable results that you can also aggregate, compare and segment. And we'll always try to find ways to make this part of an ongoing learning agenda and have this data feed into decision-making, planning cycles and strategic decision-making going forward. So if we go to the next slide, we can probably go through this one quite quickly because I'm just gonna, this is a holder to say that we're gonna go through the survey questions. So if we go to the next slide, here are some of our top tips when it comes to writing your survey questions. So here are some things that we'd encourage you to think about as a step one when you're thinking about your survey design. First and foremost, there's a lot already out there. So first, research what surveys exist by reputable organisations that you can reuse. This means that somebody's already done the work behind it, so it means you don't need to recreate the wheel, but also importantly, in many cases, if these are existing survey questions, it may also have the added benefit of coming with national data. So to give you two examples that we frequently use, and I'm going to show these in some further slides, we use the PPI methodology to assess the poverty reach of an organisation's interventions. So that uses an IPA survey question to ask an individual a number of different questions around their asset and consumption patterns to essentially find the probability that they live within a certain income bracket. And there is national data that we can compare that against. So that's been a really, really good tool that we've reused time and time again in hundreds of studies and provides a huge amount of value. Secondly, in the disability category, we use the Washington Group survey questions, which helps assess the rate of disability and can tell you a bit about your inclusivity, and again has national data. So first and foremost, research what's out there. Secondly, when you're writing your own questions, ensure that they, as much as possible, avoid bias. This ensures you're not using leading questions, you're avoiding anything around judgment. I don't think bias can ever be totally removed, but as much as possible, we can consider it in the kind of questions that we're asking and making sure it's as low as it possibly can be. And also being respectful. Make it a survey that your respondents want to answer as much as possible. Try and make it fun, make it short, make it connectable, make it a good experience for the respondent. We'd encourage you to always ask a combination of closed and open-ended questions to have a well-rounded survey. Those closed questions will give you those comparable data points, and the open-ended questions will really start to help you understand what's driving some of this performance from your beneficiaries and what more they want, and be able to get some actionable feedback. And I'd structure your survey questions in a way that allows standardization, because this will be what allows for your comparability and performance benchmarks over time. So, if we go on to the next slides. So some examples of some lean data core questions to give you some examples of some of what I've just talked about. So as I mentioned up front, we have a kind of core survey set, which are the questions that we ask in all of our studies, which should encourage you to structure a survey in such a way. And first and foremost, we've aligned this to the impact management project, which is one thing I would like to share with you. We've aligned a lot of our core lean data indicators with this framework. And quickly, for those of you who don't know what the Impact Management Project is, it's a simple and intuitive way to think about impact. It's been created in consultation with over 2,000 practitioners, and it helps to define 5 dimensions of impact: the who you're reaching, the what and how much impact is occurring, the contribution, and the risk that that impact might not be achieved. We really recommend this framework as you approach and think about your impact measurement and management. So if you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend to have a look at it. And in our experience, at least the first 3 of these, and in some cases all 5, can be accurately described by the people experiencing the impact themselves. It's very complementary and helpful for this approach. So if we go on to the next slides. With some examples of the indicators that we're using in our core insights. So on the left covers the who of the impact management project, so really helping to ask questions that will understand who is being reached by these programs and interventions. Often this is quite an overlooked aspect of impact, and in many situations actually the who's experiencing it isn't always very well understood, and arguably it's one of the most important things to understand. And you'll see on the left some of the key things that we look at in the core surveys. First and foremost is around the beneficiary profile. So we're understanding gender breakdown, things like average age, household size, to really get an idea of the beneficiary profile. We look at their income profile. So I've mentioned this already, using the PPI methodology. We will understand the number of people living in extreme poverty, low income, and that can be done using that PPI methodology, which is open source. I'd also encourage you to look for that. And disability tends to be an optional in part of our core module. And then in the what, I just wanted to give you some examples of the kind of questions that we were using and how we've structured them. So understanding if we've actually improved somebody's quality of life is one of the key things that we always look at. So we will ask a core question. Within that, you'll see that there's categories that respondents can reply with. That really helps us with our analysis, and also is a helpful and friendly way for the respondent to answer it. And then we will always ask the qualitative follow-up questions to really understand the why and what's behind that. That's really so important to get the rich insights. The next one, then, Net Promoter Score. For those of you that don't know this, this is actually not impact specific. This is used by lots and lots of companies. It's really a very simple question that gets to the heart of the satisfaction of your customer, user, beneficiary, whoever you're interacting with. Really will give you a sense not just of their satisfaction, but of their loyalty. And it's really a good indicator, and one that can be used consistently over time as a way to track the changes in your customer satisfaction and experience. And lastly, another cool one we use is understanding whether beneficiaries had access to any alternatives. Really helps you to understand how additional this service is in the market. So yeah, I wanted to share with you that how some of those questions are structured. So if we go on to the next slide. So the next stage after we have developed the survey modules would then be to conduct data collection. So I'm going to go in again to a few key aspects of how we set this up. So if we go to the next slide, right, so these are some of the key stages that we go through with organisations to help them set up for their study. First and foremost, understanding what type of study is most relevant to the kind of insights they want to generate. So would it be a one-off because there's data that we need just to understand? A baseline and follow-up is often used before and after a particular intervention to see changes that has had in terms of people's quality of life or other indicators. A longitudinal study is an approach whereby you are asking the same people, the same set of questions, time and time again over a long period. So you're looking much more to evidence changes over time. And for example, things like their poverty levels and other aspects that it would take longer to really evidence and understand. And also, is a comparison group relevant or needed in any study? And we found ways in which we can access database of contact details of profiling of different groups that have helped us to be able to set that up. The majority of the studies that we've done and have been most helpful for our clients have either been one-off or baseline and follow-up. The next thing is to work out what method is most relevant to your study. There's different methods that you can use that you can see from that list. They'll all come at different costs. There's a different best use case for each, and each will require different tactics with things like length and sensitivity. Remote surveys will be less expensive and easier to conduct, and in fact, obviously, right now in the time that we're living in person would be almost impossible, so probably not an option. Remote surveys also have the benefit of having a high degree of anonymity, which can also help respondents feel a sense of trust and openness when they're talking to you. Sometimes they can feel more comfortable, provide feedback honestly and openly when there is an element of anonymity, which we find over the telephone. But in contrast, in-person surveys and other approaches might be needed when you're asking particularly sensitive questions. So when the researcher needs to ensure a safe space to conduct a focus group with families or around potentially sensitive issues. So online and IVR will be some of the cheapest approaches, but that will come with disadvantages. The response rates would tend to be lower, and it's much more difficult to get good qualitative insights. Telephone tends to be the approach that we find most successful. So over 90% of the surveys that we conduct are over the telephone. That has a slightly higher cost to it, not just in the cost of telephones, but in our commissioning of researchers. But the reason that we find this the most successful approach is because it allows us to have that personal interaction with respondents, to be able to try and get a rapport with them. But also having conducted this over the telephone means that we can do this relatively fast at a relative low cost. So we think it strikes a good balance. But things like SMS and online and IVR would also be a good way if you want to collect short bursts of data. And remember that you can always use a mixed method depending on your needs. So you might deploy multiple SMS messages to get regular intervals of data, and possibly will follow that up with phone if you want to complement it with more qualitative insights. The next thing, we think through what the most appropriate sampling strategy is. And for us to share, I mean, we predominantly always use randomized sampling because we think it's the best way of reducing any bias, unless there's a particular stratification that a client or program is interested in. So understanding a particular age group or gender group, for example. But random sampling is what we would recommend and we most often use. And then also working with clients to look at what is the right confidence interval. So this will implicate your sample size. So how much confidence do you need or want in the data. So for example, a 95% confidence interval is typically required for an academic study. The kind of studies that we do in terms of generating insights to make decisions, about an 80 to 90% confidence interval should be sufficient to have confidence to take decisions on. And you can calculate your own confidence interval. There are confidence calculators online that you can use if you put in a mixture of your sample size and your population size that will help you use that data to target therefore what your sample size should be to get you the confidence level that you would like. And then the last tip is test the survey before you implement it. Test. And when you execute, ensure that you're consistently checking quality throughout. So we would often have a 1 or 2 day pilot at the beginning where we're listening quite closely into any hesitations or questions where respondents might feel hesitant or sensitive or not really understand the question before we really kind of implement the survey in volume. So if we go on to the next slide, here are some key things that we train our researchers in when they're conducting telephone surveys that would be helpful if you are considering conducting these. Always explain why you're calling. Be respectful, ask if it's a good time to call or if there's a better time to speak to them. Be very, very respectful and careful of their time. Actually, we have written a special script since the pandemic that really is respectful even more of the situations they might be currently in, asking people how they are and making sure it's still an okay time for us to be calling and speaking to them. Train your researchers in sensitivity. When speaking to somebody over the phone, you always want to make sure you're being as courteous and respectful as you would in person. And importantly, make sure that you or your researchers, whoever's calling, sticks to the script. You want to ensure that your data is comparable and making sure that where you're using different researchers, they're trained so that the responses to all the different parts of the questions are the same and the questions are asked in the same way. So if we go to the next slide. So the next phase, the analysis phase, here I'm going to take you through some results of some companies and funds we've been working with to show you examples of the data analysis that you can produce from this kind of approach. So if you go to the next slide. Here is an overview of an organisation we've worked with a number of times called Sunny Money. It's an off-grid energy company. And here you'll see what we've done with the key indicators that have been generated through these survey results, categorised them by the type of impact, and you'll see on the right-hand side we've shown how their performance compares to the global benchmark, and you can see how that therefore becomes a very powerful tool to really show people how they are performing. Those numbers alone might be interesting, but against a benchmark, give particular context to how this company is performing. So if we go into the next slide, this is an example of the WHO, the income profile methodology that we're using. This is how we present and analyse the PPI methodology. We will show the percentage of beneficiaries that are being reached at a different income level, and we will always compare it to national data. So again, having that comparable is key to really understand, are you over or under penetrating certain income groups? On the next slide, we'll give you an example of another question that was earlier in my presentation around the quality of life. So you'll see there how we can present the different categories and how it kind of comes to life when you visualize it like this, and what we can do with the follow-up quotes to really give some insights around what's driving some of this performance. If we go to the next slide. I wanted to show an example of how we've done this for a fund, and this might be relevant if you're working on programs where there's lots of different programs or lots of different companies that you're supporting, and how you can bring that data together to show comparison across the portfolio. So what we've done here is, you'll see at the bottom, these are the different impact indicators that we used in the study and collected through the survey and the data collection. We have then used an index methodology to give each of those impact performance a performance number, and we can show against each of the different impact indicators how that company is performing and how that compares to the portfolio average. This is a really, really helpful to be able to get a snapshot, of how your portfolio is performing, but really start to identify where companies might be over or underperforming, and what can we learn from that? And really, all of this needs to be contextualized, because we'll also learn from it in the context of that organization strategy, but where one might be particularly performing highly when it comes to inclusivity or gender, it will really give us an opportunity to really delve deep and understand a bit more about the why. So we'll identify some good learning opportunities across your portfolio. And if we go to the next slides, I also wanted to show it another way that we're using the data even further, is we're matching it sometimes with business and operational and finance data. So where we can bring things like scale and finance and impact together, we can start to see some patterns in the data and really help us understand how these things interplay. So that's really the end of, so if we go to the next slide, there was one further thing. So that really ends the lean data process and the very whistle-top tour of how we've conducted this impact measurement and insights. And I hope some of that is helpful for your programs and your activities, and gives you some kind of thoughts and inspiration for how you might be able to develop and deliver some of this. The thing that I wanted to end on was what Callum mentioned in the introduction, was really to share with everybody here that we are doing a fair amount of data collection on COVID-19. So since the 1st of April, we've been doing data collection across 14 different countries, to really understand how people are being affected, how this crisis is affecting both their health, their lives, their livelihoods. And we're making all of this data publicly available. We have a public dashboard which you can find either via our website, or we'll share a link following this. And our aim is to provide people with useful information to help them to understand and respond. So I really wanted to share that this data is available, and please do have a look, and I hope it's useful to you.
Great, thank you, Katie. We've got some great questions coming in, so I'll just quickly run through my session and then open up to Q&A. So I'm going to quickly walk you through a case study of where I've applied a kind of lean data principles. So some of the kind of tools that you've just talked through, but also the kind of wider user-centered approach to measurement. So just moving to the next slide. Thanks, Apache. So two main projects come to mind. First on the left was a project I ran, which is a kind of global project providing kind of farming and nutrition information to farmers and others. And this ran via app, via SMS, or via voice, depending on the location. And the measurement we used here included things such as call centers, rapid feedback surveys, and also leveraging tools like the PPI, the probability of poverty index that Katie mentioned. But what I'm going to focus on instead is the one on the right, which was building a kind of chatbot focusing on providing sexual and reproductive health information to adolescent girls. And this is across 5 countries, 4 in Africa and then 1 in Asia Pacific. I figured I'd focus on this one as it's more of a kind of smart cities digital context, but happy to discuss both in the questions. So just on to the next slide. So no, just one back. Perfect, thank you. So as I mentioned, this is particularly relevant for smart cities. What we're doing here is trying to leverage digital channels, so both smartphone and online, to fill a really kind of meaningful gap, which was a lack of useful, accurate and unbiased healthcare information. And this is due to a lack of urban and rural health facilities or other sources of information for this group. And we went from design research with users through to prototyping and piloting with just over 2,000 users across 5 countries in a little over a month. And we used Facebook Messenger as it was the quickest to get to a prototype, and it was also used quite extensively across the 5 countries we are interested in. However, the backend tool that we used for the chatbot is a tool called Rapid Pro, which is an open source tool. It's actually available in our digital open source toolkit, which Phil will drop a link to in the chat. And this meant that we could actually plug the chatbot into other channels like WhatsApp or others without having to do too much reworking. So just moving to the next slide. Perfect. So this is about fitting into the user journey. And hopefully it's loading. Wow, it's loading very slowly on my side. Cool. So the first aspect we learned very much echoes Katie's presentation about trying to fit into the user journey. So measurement can't be extractive, particularly in a digital channel. We had what was fundamentally quite a simple chatbot. As I mentioned, it was built in Facebook Messenger. It had a relatively linear journey between topics, and we had a few kind of quizzes thrown in there as well. However, what we saw across just over 2,000 users was more than 1,000 unique user journeys as girls explored the chatbot. And this is only half of the massive circle in terms of navigating each of those user journeys. So each of those single strands is a single user And you can see some have kind of shared journeys, but very, very few took the same pathway through the chatbot. So what this highlighted to us is that in this context, every step needs to add value to the user. If not, they'll go elsewhere. We can't add any burden, and hence why measurement needs to be agile, lean, and also fit into that kind of user journey as well. So just moving to the next slide. Perfect. This one loaded a bit quicker. So this is, I think, quite a useful demonstration. What we did try and do as well is we did try formal surveys in the chatbot, so the kind of typical Q&A, but we saw very variable and very different user engagement. And we tested different messaging, timings, and other variables to see what exactly this drove this kind of different engagement. But what really came to the fore, though, was the need to kind of build engagement and trust with users first. We needed to demonstrate value before looking to engage them from a measurement perspective. And what we saw with feedback and also some of the data in terms of the response rates was formal surveys and questioning can sometimes feel extractive. It requires users to provide information or data, and it detracts from the kind of journey or the engagement that they want in the chatbot or the tool in the first place. They didn't come to us to ask questions. They came to us to learn and to find knowledge. They didn't come to answer our surveys or similar. We did do formal surveys, and the graph there speaks to one of these, but we definitely saw definite drop-offs after particularly the second and a sixth question. And this echoes research elsewhere, including some from the lean data team. I think that notes there's definitely a kind of ideal maximum of questions in a digital channel. Just as a kind of slightly side point as well, I think this is also where the value of digital comes into play. Digital, through things like chatbots or others, it allows you to do invisible measurement. So using data from the back end of systems. And we saw this as a really kind of particular advantage, as it doesn't require any formal input from the user, and can also be measured over the longer term and at very regular intervals, which both reflects the kind of always on nature of a tool like a chatbot, but also the longitudinal importance of measurement that Katie discussed as well. And this was actually quite exciting because it contrasts a little with more offline interventions where measurement is often, you're limited by budget or time or availability. So you're capturing data at a particular moment in time. So actually the fact we could capture data and measure over the longer term was a really exciting way of working. And then onto the next slide, just as a kind of final point here, what we had, as Katie also mentioned as well, is about understanding what you want to measure, including what impact looked like. And for us, this is where the lean data and the portfolio approach to measurement really worked well. It encouraged us particularly to kind of look at the solution in a more holistic way. So for us, for the first initial phases of kind of testing and scaling, the measurement we employed focused more on utility. So what was working for users, what wasn't working, how to engage more users, including kind of conversion rates, and also the success of different ways of getting people into the chatbot and how to keep them in there, that kind of retainment as well. And these metrics are useful going forward, but particularly at that initial stage where you're trying to build a tool and test it was really, really valuable. But beyond that, though, we also had to look at more typical development KPIs, so increases in knowledge and so on. And again, these couldn't be extracted. They had to be kind of carefully weaved into that user journey. And we use things like gamification, quizzes, or when signposting users to other resources, ask them if they found information helpful or not. But what we found and learned very quickly was all measurement had to be very much focused on driving actionable improvements to the chatbot. So again, echoing some of Katie's presentation, even the quizzes themselves were used to identify areas where users had a perhaps lower than expected initial knowledge of a topic, and allowed us then kind of prioritize future content development and how we could improve the chatbot further. And then just moving to the next slide. So this is across the chatbot and also the other work I've done around lean data. There's a few thoughts that have kind of come out over and over again for me. The first is something I've mentioned already, which is about measurement can't detract from the user experience or the service experience. It can't be extractive. So the value of digital and back-end metrics were really, really useful for us. And we also looked at kind of broadening the measurement workflow. So instead of just looking at the chatbot itself, we looked at everything from the kind of onboarding via Facebook and other adverts, measuring engagement with those, and then also looking at how users engaged on other platforms after leaving the chatbot through using things like Google Analytics and other digital tools. That second point is about ensuring understanding how to make measurement useful for you as an organization as well. We maybe got a little bit too keen at the start, and we measured everything, but we very, very quickly drowned in data. We had hundreds or sometimes thousands of different data points for each user. And we also wanted to use measurement to drive improvements during the pilot phase. And so what we're doing, because we're tweaking and improving the chatbot every week, we had to turn around measurement and reporting and data very quickly. And that meant streamlining what we measured, but also balancing with metrics measured over the longer term, so we could see how the chatbot was developing over a longer period of time as well. And then this also links, I think, to that final point. So digital interventions allow you to get very granular with users, so you can understand the user journey on a very micro level, which is that big circle diagram I highlighted earlier. And this can sometimes be by single users. But this can also lead you to focusing on individual data points, and sometimes at the expense of bigger things like your solution as a whole, or how it's meeting the needs of an entire community. And I think this is a little bit of a risk with digital, is that you can segment too much or focus excessively on these kind of individual data points. And that means that you forget about the broader insights that drive iteration and also impact as well. And to pick up a point that Katie mentioned about bias, we saw that this could actually risk biasing us in how we develop or iterate the chatbot, because we could fixate very quickly on the experience of a certain group of users, but that could be at the expense of actually improving the chatbot for the entire community. So just trying to find a balance between that individual, that digital enables, and that wider element is really important. So just moving to the final slide. One more. Perfect. So this is very much concluding thoughts, and then we'll start the questions, and there's quite a few coming in. So I think the reason we scheduled this webinar in particular is that we hear a lot about big data, but very little about lean data. And actually lean data can be in some ways much more useful in international development than big data, which requires very specific tools, processes, and also isn't suitable for many interventions. Lean data, I think, as you've heard from Katie, is a really applied, actionable way of doing data collection and monitoring and evaluation, both in terms of the tools that are used, like surveys, call centers, and similar, but also the principles behind it too. And that's very much echoed in that second point. For us, particularly in the smart cities and digital context, monitoring, evaluation, and learning aren't negotiable. You have to be doing them. And so I think that's where lean data has particular value, is that everyone can use lean data. You can use the tools that have been designed, you can use the processes and the methods that Katie just walked through to fit into any product or service in international development. So it's all about driving that kind of actionable change. And then linked to that as well is that final point, particularly when we're shifting more things into a digital context. It's about understanding the value of lean data to make very meaningful and actionable improvements to the products and services that are informing a lot of our work and a lot of lives in an urban and more rural context as well. So we think that lean data is a really valuable, really important approach for smart cities and digitalization. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to hand over to Phil, and we can kick off the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Callum. And thanks, Katie, as well. Really fantastic presentations, both. Yep, so we're gonna, thanks everyone also for making my life so much easier, because I see tons of really great questions coming in. You know, normally we're like, oh, is anyone gonna be asking questions? But there are tons and tons, and that's fantastic. So I thought, you know, you guys have been listening to us for a solid 48 minutes. Let's do something a bit more interactive. So I've asked a couple of our attendees who have asked questions to ask them live. So we have on the line Sir Hao Lim. So how would you like to ask your question live? You've got a really interesting one up there.
Hey, hi, this is C House here. Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Yep.
Hi.
Okay, thanks, Filzer. Thanks, Katie and Callum, for the presentation as well. I think it's really interesting to look at the different process. I think one question I would like to ask, and often I think it's important, part of the piece about lean data, it's about iterative process of change, how we measure stuff as well, right? So I was wondering, like, because one of the key point was standardization and repeatability is like one of the key core elements in the process. So how do we actually effectively test a survey or data collection methods prior to deploying it, right? And a follow-up of that is like, do you actually iterate the questions once you deploy it? Because most of the time we we might have missed out certain assumptions or thought that these questions would yield certain results, and end up as we receiving those answers or inputs from the respondents, it turns out very differently because they might be misunderstanding the open-ended question, or the certain options that we provided in the closed-ended questions aren't really understood properly, right? So one, how do we test before we prior to deploying it? Two, it's do we actually iterate the questions once we deploy it?
Thanks, Rahul. Okay, Katie, would you like to field this question, please?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for the question. Yeah, no, so I guess there's two things in this. Like, how do we test, and how much do we need to iterate once the deployment has started? So the testing for us, I mean, there'll be, we are testing questions continuously, kind of time and time again, that allowed us now to kind of have some quite trusted survey questions, but obviously it was a bit of a journey to get there. And so you'll experience the same thing as you develop this, and in each individual project, as you are writing survey questions, there may be a small or friendly group of customers, or another maybe kind of group of people who meet the specific profile that you would still like to talk to, that you can test the questions on. So that's really, kind of how easy were they to ask, which is the other element as well. It needs to be comfortable for both sides. How well were they understood, and what kind of insights did that allow you to generate? That's kind of stage one in the writing of the survey. And then when it's the setup of the data collection, what we tend to do, and we're not doing the surveys ourselves, we're using our researchers, so it might be different depending on what approach that you are taking. But we will have, like, day 1 and 2 will always be our pilot phase, and we are listening to a couple of calls. We're also continuously in contact with our researchers, and we're looking out for things like hesitation on whether people are misunderstanding the question, and our researchers will be well enough trained to know whether that question has not been well understood. And so they will bring that back to us and flag it if there is a problem. And yes, it's very important that you're iterative enough that you can take the brave move to say in day 2, we need to change the question, people aren't understanding it. That's quite important. But definitely try to isolate that to a pilot phase. What you don't want is to get halfway through and think, oh, actually, it would be interesting to also know this, or to tweak the question. Like, I definitely wouldn't recommend that, because standardization will be key to getting good insights. But certainly, going to all of that trouble requires a lot of attention to be focused on the pilot phase. I mean, when we work with clients, we really recommend the stage in which you want to get really, really involved is in the survey design, and we get very, very involved in the pilot, and then data collection can, if you've got like capability set up, be quite seamless, as can the analysis, again, if you're well enough set up. And then you also mentioned kind of being iterative in general. If you're using repeatable surveys time and time again with companies, and therefore how do you balance that standardization versus iteration? And for us, what has worked well is having that distinction between the core modules that we will always use time and time again, versus thematic or sector or specific modules based on the particular time or focus. So in always mixing the two, it means you will always have an element of comparability as well as customization to that particular organization.
Thanks very much, Katie. Cool. And we also had a really great question coming in from Ivanilda. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Ivanilda. So Ivanilda, would you like to ask your question?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, it's Ivanilda, you're right. All right, thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. Actually, I've been following your training sessions, so they are very useful. I'm from Cabo Verde in Africa, so thank you. I would like to ask on the difference between the National Statistics Institute's surveys, and the difference between the Lean Data Process surveys and the ones run by the National Statistics Institute. So it's my curiosity. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivanilda. Katie and Callum, would you guys like to jump in on this? Maybe Katie goes first.
In what way are you curious to know if they're different in terms of how they're conducted, or the questions, or?
Yes, how they are conducted, for instance, because I think that that's what exactly we want to do here. I'm talking about the feasibility and also the how fast we can have the results, because we know that the National Statistics Institute normally they go through a lot of rules, and to have the impact of the results of the data sometimes gets times is an issue. And also regarding the questions, if I see that the procedures are quite similar, but what actually would be the difference when you run the survey or you get the data? I wanted to know how is the difference. I don't know if you get what I mean.
I don't actually know their approach well enough to be able to answer that. Maybe Callum can. I mean, in terms of speed, it typically takes us between 6 and 9 weeks to do an end-to-end lean data process. But I don't know the specifics of how they run their studies to be able to answer that question. Callum, do you?
Yeah, a little bit. So I think what you tend to look at with national stats bureaus and similar will be kind of larger household surveys. And sometimes these can be, 1,000 or so questions long, can take 6, 7, sometimes even 8 hours to get through. So I think there's what we're trying to say is there's no best approach to measurement. It's very much a toolkit. So lean data, I think, I don't want to speak for Katie, but for me seems to be very much a very good way of building actionable improvement to products and services over time. Whereas national stats bureaus and similar are very much looking at a kind of snapshot and a kind of country journey, so kind of bigger measurement interventions. And there's value to both. It just very much depends the kind of problem or questions that you're asking.
All right, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivanilda. Thanks, Callum and Katie. Cool. Moving right on to some of the other questions. So a couple of these questions have come in from anonymous attendees. So I'm just going to read them out. And there's a really good one here, which I think both Katie and Callum can answer. And the question is, I always thought of the lean approach as an approach to only answer the most crucial, pivotal questions. As I understand from you, you are also getting data on the socio-economic surroundings, etc. Already into the direction of classic surveys. Where would you make the difference between these two? So that's the question. Katie, would you like to answer this one? Or Callum?
I'm happy to say very simply and then hand over. The approach can be used for both, and I think it will depend what your goals are in terms of the data that you would like to collect. The shortest kind of survey that we conduct with organisations predominantly is used for things like due diligence. I want very quickly to get some real impact data to answer these top 3 questions, versus we then can work with organisations to do deep dives where we do, we delve into more of the socioeconomic aspects, and there'll be a lot more qualitative responses back from respondents. And so the difference will be, one will be about 10 questions, take about 5 to 10 minutes to ask, and we can do in about 3 weeks. And the second one will be about 40 questions, take about 20 minutes to ask, and probably about 7 to 9 weeks. One thing to mention that I didn't mention in my presentation is around length of survey. Like, our protocol is never to go above 40 questions and 15 minutes to make sure that you are giving your respondent a very good, as good as possible an experience.
Just to add to that, I think that very much echoes the question we just talked about as well. But one interesting example is a tool Katie mentioned, the probability of poverty index, the PPI. It's stuff I've used in actually quite a few countries, and what's kind of come around from that is that they've taken these massive household surveys that I just talked to and looked at each question to see which is the best predictor of someone being in poverty. So instead of asking 10 questions about how someone lives in their house, they're asking one question about, what material is your roof made out of? And then using those 10 questions, they can then provide, the measurement can provide a kind of measurement probability of someone living in poverty or not. So I think there's also, lean data does have, I think, value in that more socioeconomic piece, but it's just very much, as Katie mentioned, understanding what you're trying to explore, and then looking over the questions or the wider tools like things like the PPI, which from my understanding is still very much a lean approach to how we collect data.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Callum. Fantastic. So there are a couple more questions here. So we just scheduled maybe about 10 or 15 minutes more for this session. But I think most people thought it was just going to be an hour. So if you have to go, no worries. We do have the recording that's going to be shared with you after the webinar. So we'll probably send it out by next week, along with the slides once we get permission from both speakers to share them. And we'll also share a couple of these questions in our wrap-up email. So don't worry if you have to step out, but I highly encourage you to stay on. So we've got a couple more questions here, and from our great friend, Aunt Hussar. So Aunt's a great friend of the Global Center. Let me just read out this question here. I think Anne was asking if during, Katie, this is during your presentation, a clarification on whether that survey method you were speaking about earlier is a perception survey method. When comparing to your 3 core impact measures across countries, cultures, and companies, do you get a lot of noise because of varying context? And if so, what's the remedies there? Katie, over to you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. We do, I mean, you know, we're using standardized indicators and standardized question sets, but, you know, the respondent and the information that you get back will also be highly context specific. And it's always important for us to understand that when we interpret the data. We possibly don't use any different approaches when we think about asking the questions, but we do when it looks into interpreting it. And actually one of the main things that we do is ensuring that we understand the organization's activities and to ensure their sector, their stage, kind of what they've been doing to make sure that we can understand the impact results. So sometimes companies are kind of nervous of getting the data because they're a bit nervous of what it's going to say. But you know, this will always be judged against an organization's goals and intentions and strategies, and that's important to understand. And the next thing we do to make it highly context specific is that our benchmarks we will offer by region and by sector. So when we're comparing an organization's performance, for example, how much have they improved somebody's impact or quality of life, we tend to look at it in, for example, other companies or programs within that sector, within that region, to make sure that we're, you know, I wouldn't say like for like, but we're providing the most useful comparable that we possibly can.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie. Callum, would you like to add on at all? Add on at all, I mean.
I think that covers all of it.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, there are a couple more questions coming in here, but I think we're just going to wrap up with just one last question, just a bit mindful of time. So I had a question of my own, and this is to both Katie and Callum. And I think really it's more about if we can just distill everything that's been talked about in the last hour into just like one paragraph about what sort of social impact you can achieve with lean data. What can a government agency achieve if they use lean data principles right? Katie, would you like to answer that?
I mean, the main thing that I would like to see is the use of impact data in planning and decision making, very much like a program or a government and organization would look at financial and operational data when they're putting together a plan and making decisions. I would like to see impact data on a par with that.
Fantastic. And Callum?
Cool. Just to add to what Katie mentioned, I think lean data is very much an approach that's focusing on products and services. So often a lot of times with the private sector. And I think bringing some of that thinking into local government, national government, again, that kind of very user-centered, human-centric approach to measurement could be really beneficial in the same way that we've seen digital services in government improved by learning from the best of the private sector too.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much, Callum. Thanks so much, Katie, for great presentations today and for answering all these fantastic questions. So let's just wrap up and thanks once again, everyone, for joining us. So this is our second last training series webinar before we break for the summer. So in our wrap-up email, we're going to be sending out like the slides and the recording, and also we're going to be inviting you to the very last one, which is on gender inclusion, and that's happening on the 6th of August. Hope to see you there, and thank you once again. Thanks so much for joining us joining us online. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and be well. Bye-bye.